Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's MarkMonitor webinar, which is titled Going After the Big Fish. My name is Kevin Dane. I'm hosting the next sort of 45 minutes or so, and I've been with MarkMonitor for 9 years now. And over that time, I've seen a pretty dramatic shift in the online environment and different areas that people are focusing on. I think one of the problems and one of the reasons for me joining the company is that I saw there was a great opportunity for fraudsters to impose brands and to pretend to be organizations. 9 years ago, the fraudsters were very opportunistic. They were selling domain names, often registering names before a company had even thought of their online presence. They were busy diverting traffic to competitor sites, or they were selling cheap counterfeits. And typically, it was very easy for people to see that it was a counterfeit because the price point was incredibly low and the quality was equally low. Over the last 9 years, though, I think there's been a whole environment change, and we still have those fraudsters that are trying to trade on the back of somebody else's brand, but they're actually a highly organized, connected criminal gangs that are running very large counterfeit networks. So we still have those same fraudsters, but we also have the bigger, more organized guys. They're leveraging best practices in online marketing. They're targeting a brand from multiple points, be it websites, social media, mobile applications. And ultimately, they're often more efficient than a brand owner themselves. They don't have a CEO to report to. They can be highly flexible and highly innovative. So it's my belief that it's very important to tackle the daily grind of infringements, but it's also critical to identify and deal with the high-value target, or in the case of today's webinar, going after the big fish. On the bottom right-hand side of your WebEx screen, there's a question and answer session. Please feel free to ask questions. If I can notice them and if they're relevant to the content, then I'll address them there and then. I'll try to build the answers into my presentation. Otherwise, there'll be an opportunity at the end of the session to go through those. And obviously, if there is anything that isn't covered in today's session, my contact details are on the last slide. So please feel free to email me separately as a follow-up. So our agenda for today is broken down into 4 key areas. Firstly, identifying organized online crime, looking at different clusters and different networks and ultimately those high-value targets. To review some of the cases that we've helped build against these fraudsters. To look at the different enforcement actions against these sorts of threats. And then finally, just to try to quantify a little bit about the financial impact and the return on investment that an organization could see through going down this particular route. Now, the internet is a pretty big thing. 40% of the world's population are now online. There's 3 billion internet users. There's been tremendous growth in Asia. Only a third of people are online in Asia, but it actually represents 45% of all global users. Europe and the Americas have very, very high rates of online access, and we're only going to see this grow. And there was an interesting statistic that was released at the end of last year that they believe that by 2017, 2018, there'll actually be 3 times as many internet connections as there are people, as people have more and more connected devices. So the internet obviously is growing. It's obviously here to stay, but the way that we interact with the internet has changed, and the way that we interact it's going to evolve on a minute-by-minute, a day-by-day basis. Now, I was going to say something very flippant like computers are dead, but the reality is for a lot of people, they don't interact with the internet with a computer. They're using a tablet, they're using a mobile device. They're not necessarily going to websites anymore. They're going to social media pages. They're going to mobile applications. And the way that the internet is changing is also the way that people are interacting with brands. Now, I'm very lucky. I've got quite a few kids, and for good or bad, My eldest children, they actually get their homework delivered directly to an iPad. I personally don't really agree with it, but it's certainly the way that things are evolving. My 6-year-old daughter, she doesn't talk about a website, she talks about an app, because that's what they're being educated in school. And it's only people like myself, us old Luddites, that are still using the internet originally how it was designed. I think it's really interesting to look at what happens in an internet minute. A minute's a pretty short space of time, but there are millions of interactions with things like Facebook. There's 3.5 million pieces of content posted on Facebook. There's almost 7 million messages sent through Facebook. 10 million online adverts are displayed every single minute. If we look at some of the biggest Asian marketplaces, things like Alibaba, on their Black Friday sales, $400 million of sales in a single minute. And then things like Netflix and YouTube, they account for over half of all internet traffic. It's an incredible thing, the internet, and it's equally, a pretty dangerous, a dangerous environment for brand owners as well. So as revenues grow for brands in the online environment, the threats and the dangers to those brands grow as well. I've just picked up a few snapshots here. The first one is from Interpol. Interpol have recently published an article about the role of organised crime in online counterfeiting. There was a report by the EU Observatory that looks at the scale of fashion sector losses just in the EU, and they value that at $28 billion a year. It's an absolutely astronomical number. But it's not just fashion and apparel that's affected. If we look at online pharmacies, and the whole pharmaceutical network, then there's a massive issue with counterfeit drugs and counterfeit websites that are selling those drugs. If you buy a piece of fashion and it's fake, then the chances are that you'll be a bit disappointed. If you buy a drug that doesn't do what it does, what it's meant to, it could end up killing you or not curing that illness that you wanted it for. And no company is immune. I'm sure we all recall last year that the issue that Apple had around malware in a number of apps that was hosted on the App Store, which is meant to be a pretty secure environment. So threats are growing in lots of different areas. As a company, I have to do my bit of company stuff. MarkMonitor, we've been trading since 1999, and over that time we've been both innovative and thought leaders in the brand protection space, and we're absolutely the leading company in helping to police the online environment for our clients. 8 out of 10 of the highest traffic websites, people like Microsoft, Google, use MarkMonitor and rely on MarkMonitor to help protect that environment. And I think one other area that we're part of Thomson Reuters is intellectual property and science division, and that helps us leverage a lot of internal Thomson Reuters assets, particularly around things like trademark registrations that sit hand in hand alongside trying to build a brand. Our head office is in San Francisco, and we now have about 600 people in the company. When we look at some of the challenges for brand owners, it's often difficult to get a comprehensive overview of all of the different forms of online abuse. Traditionally, things like website cybersquatting have been fairly prevalent. More recently, things like social media have become critical to understand how they're being used and abused, both against the brand, but also potentially against key individuals inside the organization. It's important to be able to see whether your affiliate and partner and distribution network are behaving themselves on things like paid search and not inadvertently driving up the cost that you're having to spend on that environment. And then things like mobile applications, it's important to understand whether there are rogue mobile apps that are affecting either your brand or the content that your brand delivers. Some of the consequences of inaction, of not doing anything, it could be lost sales, it could be reputational damage, it could be an increased number of customer complaints, and an erosion of your overall brand equity. And I think often some of the difficulties with a brand protection program is to understand what the net impact and what that return on investment looks like for you as a company. Because certainly in my experience, each company can measure ROI in a very different way. I was with one of my clients in the Nordics last week, and their biggest concern is about the number of fake products that get sent back. And over the last couple of years, we've reduced that dramatically, so they class the product as successful. Another client may look at what their cost per click is for Google AdWords that they're bidding on, or what the site traffic cost is, or the cost per click for their environment. So each company, and often different people within the same organization, would like to measure ROI in a slightly different way. It's important for companies to try to prioritize what they want to do with their brand protection program. And the difficulty is that it's not possible to boil the ocean. When we start working with companies, we often start with what we call a landscape report that gives an overview of all the different forms of infringement. Then we can help prioritize the important areas and those high-value targets to start with. It's not worth focusing effort on a site that doesn't receive traffic, although it may be infringing your brand. It's far more important to focus on the sites that are receiving 1,000 visits a day, or in the case of one of my clients, we found a Facebook page that had 600,000 likes that wasn't actually connected with the brand. That actually led to a counterfeit physical shop. It's important to look at the identification of distributors and resellers, particularly if you're a company that has come from a more traditional offline environment. Maybe 20, 30 years ago, you were actively promoting people to put a picture of your brand in their shop window. You don't necessarily want them to be using that same logo and stock images in the online environment. There's also often a disconnect between the way somebody is being represented in the offline environment and the branding that they're using in the online environment. And we often work with brand owners to try to help define the internet rules and the terms and conditions to be able to identify those distributors and resellers and to monitor them in the correct way to make sure that they're following those guidelines and procedures and aren't straying too far out of it. I've mentioned a little bit about prioritization of cases. It's also sometimes valuable to segmentize them as well, to look at different aspects of the internet in isolation, to find those high-value targets, to then extrapolate that data and turn that into actionable intelligence across the whole of the internet infrastructure. There's a challenge around focusing the resources. There will always be more cases than budget allows. And the enforcement measures need to be on par with the scale of the threat. You don't want to be taking legal action against every infringer online. You want to save that for the 1 or 2 cases a year that you can have a material impact to the company. The rest of the enforcement that you want to be doing should be fully automated, should be very high volume, and should be very low cost. And ultimately, as I've mentioned a number of times already, it's trying to link that back to whatever your return on investment is. One of the things that we've seen evolve over the last few years are clusters and networks of infringement. And this is where dozens, potentially hundreds, in lots of cases thousands of different sites are selling counterfeits that are being linked back to a single person, a single entity, and often a single organized criminal gang. Often, most traditional methods for identifying these are missed because the vast majority of these websites are not indexed. They're not necessarily hidden on the internet, but they're not being actively promoted. And the people that are behind these, they're reliant on companies like MarkMonitor to shut down a number of websites, or for a brand owner themselves to shut down a number of websites. They will then immediately skew that traffic to a new website, to a fresh website. So it automatically, they'll be using their SEO skills to promote that site faster and quicker than the companies can shut them down. And traditional methods have been focused on the endpoint and shutting down the individual endpoint rather than going back and finding what that high-value target looks like. And we have to remember that those endpoints are spread across websites, across marketplace listings, across social media, across mobile applications. So it's important to get that holistic view and to understand the full network and take appropriate action against that. So we believe to win, brands must play both defensively and offensively. Traditionally, the defensive measures that we've helped organizations with are around monitoring daily for online infringement across those key internet channels, to enforce on a daily basis, to become a harder target for an organization to rip you off, and ultimately to protect and to educate your customers. It would be very wrong of me to say that we can eradicate a counterfeit issue, but what we want to do are two things. Firstly, we want to make sure that your brand is harder to attack, and secondly, and far more importantly, we want to ensure that your customers that want to interact with the brand end up on the good places and aren't being fooled into the bad places. Just going back to the counterfeit thing for a moment, if somebody wants to buy a luxury watch for €100 or $100, they're making a conscious decision to buy a replica or to buy a fake. We're never going to stop that sort of trade or that sort of need. The big difference is that if somebody has $10,000 to spend and they're transacting online, at that price point, they actually automatically believe that it's going to be a legitimate product. And in my experience, what I've seen over the last 9 years is a huge narrowing of prices between the real product and the replica or counterfeit product, because the fraudsters are getting better. They're making top quality products. They're using similar leather. They're using similar tannery processes to make a luxury bag. And in some instances, particularly at the high value luxury end, we're seeing counterfeit products being sold above list price. And that happens when a luxury brand will only release 100 handbags or something like that. They'll issue them to all of their celebrities, but people still want to get access to that product. So they're prepared to pay a premium in the belief that they're buying a legitimate product, where in fact they're actually paying a huge amount of money for a fake. So all of the action defensively needs to be looking about how we protect consumers in that environment. From an offensive perspective, we believe it's important to try to cluster the intelligence together to create what we call actionable intelligence, and then to enforce in an offline environment with both litigation, with on-the-ground enforcement, potentially raids, often involving local law enforcement to help support that effort, and ultimately trying to provide a bridge between the online environment and the physical environment. I've just mentioned actionable intelligence, and this is really about the 5 different steps in the life cycle for focusing resources where risk is the greatest. First step will be to monitor and enforce online, some of the things that I've spoken about and I'll cover in more depth in a moment. The second area is to identify those rogue networks, then to analyze the data behind that. As I'm sure you can imagine, there's potentially a vast amount of data that needs to be sifted through to turn that into information. So once you turn the data into information, we can then provide investigative services and reporting services, or an organization can themselves, to really focus back on those high-value targets. And then the final step is to equip law enforcement and determine with that information to take tangible physical steps. In terms of monitoring, these are some of the key avenues that I believe are important to monitor on a daily basis for infringement and to take actionable enforcement against. The first one would be websites. So this could potentially be looking at website content, looking at logo misuse, looking at domain name misuse across 250, 300 million different domain names. The whole domain space is becoming more and more complex with the advent of the new GTLD program, the liberalization of the internet space, which has allowed brand owners and third parties to create new extensions that are actively being sold and actively being launched on a daily basis. So as part of a website monitoring strategy, it actually needs to tie quite neatly with a domain name strategy for companies to understand what they should register in the new GTLD space, what they should block, and what they should police. The second avenue, particularly if you're a physical goods company, is monitoring the online marketplaces. And typically that's monitoring everything from the Chinese marketplaces, things like Alibaba, Made in China, Taobao, looking at eBay and Craigslist, which are more internationalized, looking at Amazon Marketplace, and it could be down to local markets, things like Snapdeal in India, Tradera in Sweden. I'm sat in Amsterdam at the moment, so Marktplaats, but would of course need a mention. And I think with the online marketplaces, a lot of, almost all of them have enforcement mechanisms for brand owners to be able to complain and to get illegitimate listings removed. The difficulty that most brand owners find is that it's often a requirement to transact in local language, to complete a 10-page form in Chinese isn't the easiest thing for most European brands to do. So what we try to help around is to automate that whole process. But equally, we have teams in China, teams in Japan that work with these marketplaces on a daily basis to help educate them and to help educate them around specific brand owners. The third area that, again, I've seen a growing threat and often a lack of visibility for brand owners is around search engine abuse. Typically, when I talk to a brand owner, they're worried about people, their competitors, using search engine advertising to try to get people to go to a different site. Now, under Google rules and under search engine rules, that's actually okay. It would only be if they were advertising in a misleading manner where you ended up on a site that they weren't actually physically advertising for, that people could enforce on. So it's important to look at that sort of abuse, but I would suggest that most search engine abuse I see is around your own affiliate network, bidding on keywords without authority, bidding out of jurisdiction, again, without authority, and ultimately creating an unfair playing field for your retailer network. And a lot of the enforcement we do is about controlling that space. The big impact that has for an organization is that it vastly reduces your own Google AdWords spend or your online advertising spend. And I was with one of my clients a few weeks ago in the UK, and we were reviewing the first 3 months of the project, specifically around search engine abuse. And in the first 3 months, the whole annual program was paid for in a reduction in their AdWords spend. They can have a pretty big impact. And when some organizations are spending millions and millions of dollars a year, a small percentage point gain can lead to a true dramatic ROI. The next area that you need to look at is around social media. And social media is a continuously evolving landscape. I was with one of my clients a few weeks ago, and we were looking at the top 100 social media networks. Now, I wish I knew what would be number one in 5 years' time. It could well still be Facebook, but it could be I Can Have Cheeseburger. It's a very bizarre social network, but it's number 80 in the list now of the top 100, and it was a name that I've never heard of. Interestingly, on that list, MySpace, which 10 years ago was the number one, is now 110th. So in social media, it's important to do a number of things. Firstly, around registration of your names. It's difficult to predict what's going to be the next Twitter. Therefore, it's important to register your name as widely across these social networks as you can, providing, of course, it doesn't add a huge amount of cost to you as an organization. Typically, we recommend the top 100 and then to review that list on an annualized basis to ensure that you're still covered against the then current top 100. And it's important because a lot of these networks require a unique username. Things like Facebook, you can have hundreds of different Kevin Days. So the threat there is less important than on a Twitter or a Pinterest or an Instagram where you can only have one unique name. And if it's not your brand name, then you're immediately diluting that. Social media, we're also seeing, as well as impersonation of brands, we also see a lot of impersonation of key executives within inside an organization. That's either for social engineering attacks against the brand, or it's for things like 419 scams, fake job scams. I remember for one of my clients in the oil industry, we found 49 Facebook profiles for that HR director. She's actually never been on Facebook in her life. And as a result of that, all of those sites were actually leading to fake job postings that were charging $50, $100 per application. None of those jobs actually existed. So it's a reputational risk for the brand as well as a real threat itself. For one of my clients in the Nordics, we found a number of fake physical shops that were connected to Facebook pages that have 50, 60,000 likes per Facebook page. Mobile applications is another area where, again, 10 years ago, mobile applications didn't exist. And today I think it's 116,000 mobile applications are downloaded every minute. It's a whole new dynamic, and it's a whole new threat for brand owners. And depending on your organization, you may be interested in different forms of infringement on mobile applications. If you are a football team, and we work with a number of football teams, a lot of them are most worried about their crest, their logo being used on a mobile application. The content itself, they're often less bothered by because it's often information that's come from a number of different news sources, so it's typically public domain, but the association with the brand is with the logo and the application title. If you're somebody in the financial services organization, then you're going to be more concerned about malicious malware, mobile malware, attacks that people that are creating lookalike apps to fool your legitimate customers, or you see threats that are appeared from a security perspective. I remember with one of my Dutch clients, we were set up the mobile application thing, and in the initial landscape reporting, we showed them an image of 9 different apps on Windows Phone. And my first question was, so which one is the real one? And the answer was that they've actually never delivered or developed anything for Windows Phone. So all 9 of those were fake. Most of them were innocuous. Most of them were built by people that just wanted to get access to that platform from the phone that they use. The difficulty, though, is that as their own website evolves and as their website requires usernames and passwords and then eventually credit card information, suddenly you've got a third-party, uncontrolled app that's effectively stealing user data. We see a continual threat in the file sharing environment and the peer-to-peer networks. Interestingly, I think that, again, when I started with MarkMonitor, the prime issue was around music piracy. That's all but disappeared now with the advent of so many different streaming services. Digital piracy on music has become far, far less important than videos, than in computer games and that sort of area. And then the final threat that still hasn't gone away is around email scams, typically phishing, typically brand-associated malware attacks that are using email to deliver those. And one of the things that is absolutely changing is the scale of those attacks is continuing to be very, very high, but the sophistication of them is very, very good. That on a daily basis, I'm receiving email that where they've spoofed an email address, so it looks as though it's coming from a legitimate site. They're using the brand names. It looks like a trusted environment. I'm really lucky because I sit in front of the computer all day, and this is my job is to try to identify these sites. For my mum, who's in her 70s, if she gets an email from her bank that's this legitimate, that's coming from the right banking address, then it's it's far more believable. And it's a great question to come in. And it's actually the next bit that I was about to cover. And that, of course, across all of that environment, what you're looking for is the abuse of an individual name, the abuse of a brand name, the abuse of logos, the abuse of maybe stock images and things like that. So it's important to scan for not just your brand name, lots of misspellings, to proactively scan for logo misuse, for content misuse, and in some instances when you're policing your affiliate network, to look for a negative match, to try to understand sites that aren't using a particular image within a specific category. So the second layer was then to look at network intelligence, and this is some pretty sophisticated multi-factor algorithms that we've created that look at hundreds of different attributes within a website. And the reason that we look at hundreds of different attributes is that what we're trying to do is to pull together commonality of information, to start grouping these sites together. And it could be the particular products that are being advertised, the price points, the checkout process, specific text or grammar, specific phrases that are being used in the terms and conditions, to then analyze the underlying JavaScript, to look at the website code, again to look for any commonalities, and then to look at other key attributes, things like the IP address, the who is information, where the traffic's coming from, who's the hosting provider, which specific records are anonymized, and to group, so from all of those different attributes to then start grouping together and correlating websites that come back to one individual or one organized criminal gang. And the technology behind it is pretty impressive. And from this, we've been able to pull together hundreds of thousands of different websites that are connected back to one individual. And it's particularly important in both the pharmaceutical environment and in fashion, in luxury and apparel. So to give you an example, this is a number of screenshots from a fake online pharmacy. So at the top level, you can see the affiliated pharmacies. They're all using different domain names. Some of them are using some of the same images. Some of them are using the same checkout processes. But ultimately, our system's being able to automatically pull all of that information together. We then look at things like the payment anchor sites, which are often more common because they're more difficult to set up, and that's led us down to a single individual behind that. Now, from that initial data, what we then, and this is the whole area of playing a more offensive concept, So we look at the rogue site networking from a data collection perspective. We look at shipping data, business registrations, online profiles across the whole of the online environment. Look at specific marketplace behavior. Are they flipping from one online marketplace to another? We then have a team of analyst experts that sit behind that, interpreting the data to then give recommendations. We can then produce investigative reports for the biggest infringers, those high-value targets, and supporting evidence. So then you can do the physical enforcement, either through raids, arrests, prosecution, and litigation. From an investigative report perspective, there's lots of different areas depending on your organization that we can focus on. It could be the high-value target. It could be things like this network intelligence. But ultimately, we'll sit down and work out what the right approach is for you as an organization, where the biggest threats are, and how to address those. So in terms of the enforcement life cycle, and the chart here is showing the sort of the three different stages, where the bottom left is the cheapest, the quickest, the most efficient manner, and the top right is the longest and most expensive option. So MarkMonitor as a company, we automate the vast majority of the stage 1 and stage 2 enforcement options. So that could be automatically delisting online marketplaces with what we call one-click enforcement. That could be targeting against individual listings, individual sellers, hundreds of listings, all being activated within a couple of clicks. We also automate the production and issue of cease and desist letters directly to website owners or to internet service providers or domain registrars. Quite often when we start working with a company, those cease and desist letters are very, very soft because they often brand owners often don't understand their authorized network and how they are perceived in the online environment. So a cease and desist letter could actually be something as soft as, we believe that you are authorized to use our logo on this site. Can you please confirm your reseller identification number? If they then come back and that information gets validated, we will then not necessarily whitelist that site because resellers are quite notorious at breaking rules, but categorize that as an authorized reseller and start policing that in a slightly different manner. Last year, so I'll come to that in a moment. The next stage is what we call brandcasting, and that gives us the ability to publish reputational information about a website. It's a very powerful tool that gets broadcast out to hundreds of millions of users of security software. And most consumers are used to, from search results, being able to see if it's got a green tick from a security perspective or a yellow question mark or a red exclamation mark. If it's got a red exclamation mark, it's often phishing for user details. We supplement that information with brand information. So if it's a company-owned site or an affiliate-verified site, then it will be broadcasted as a green. If there's counterfeit content on it, then it could be a yellow warning sign with a notification that it's selling suspect counterfeit products, or if it's asking for usernames and credentials, or if it's been certified as a counterfeit site, then it would be a red warning sign. And as I say, that goes up to literally hundreds of millions of people. The next steps could be doing whois complaints. It could be search de-indexing from the major search engines. Last year, we removed 200 million search results, primarily around file sharing and peer-to-peer networks. We can deactivate, or brand owners can deactivate payment accounts, things like PayPal, Visa Verified, MasterCard Verified, etc. Physically shutting down websites and website content through working with the domain name internet service provider or the domain name registrar. Last year, we worked with 4,500 different registrars, different ISPs, and around 1,600 different registrars to get content removed. And then the sort of final step that doesn't involve external authorities would be to domain name dispute policies, which could be UDRP, it could be URS, or any other three-letter acronym that you want to think of, a four-letter acronym. My advice for most brand owners with things like UDRP is to only go after a name if you can monetize it, if it's going to have an actual impact to your business from owning that name. It's a time-consuming, costly process, and unless you're going to utilize the name, it's not worth having. The focus in today's online environment should be about consolidating your domain name portfolio as efficiently as possible rather than growing it. Now, sure, if it's a very good typo squat of your name that's attracting a lot of traffic, it's probably worth having. If it's a name that contains a date, a hyphen, multiple uses of the same letter, it's going to have intrinsically far less value. So look at a different enforcement option to disrupt the traffic to that site rather than the UDRP process. And then the final two steps, which is really the focus around this high-value target piece, is the involvement of local law enforcement, the involvement of ground investigators to knock on factory doors, and then ultimately lawsuits to try to regain control of the internet environment. Now, in terms of what that really means is, and I'll give you a couple of examples in a moment of companies that have been very successful doing this, but it's identifying those networks and through a legal process, regaining control of all of those internet assets. And the impact can be pretty dramatic in terms of a couple of press releases. Richemont is one site here. Bellstaff announced at the end of last year that Bellstaff won a $42 million counterfeit case that was initiated through MarkMonitor data. The reality is Bellstaff will probably never get all of that $42 million, but what it's doing is sending out a very clear message to the counterfeit network and also to their consumers that Bellstaff are being incredibly successful at controlling the fake environment. They're protecting their customers as best as they can. This actual article was in Vogue. The PR that they generated as a result of this was absolutely vast. It was millions of dollars worth of PR they got on the back of this court case. So it reassures consumers to trust in the brand, and equally it tells the counterfeit networkers, we're onto this, you need to focus on somebody else's brand. And then beyond domain name, I've covered most of these areas already, but it's important to look at the lifetime value of a customer. I read a report last year about the lifetime value of a Facebook fan, and for a brand owner, it was around $150 for the lifetime. Now, the statistics behind that could probably be manipulated in lots and lots of ways, but and equally, where I've seen sites that have attracted 500,000 likes, it will be completely perverse of me to say that will generate you an extra $85 million. But it does have an impact, and if consumers are used to transacting in a particular way that happens to be a fraudulent site, they're probably going to go back there and back there. We're not looking at counterfeit products that are useless goods that are sold down the market that are cheap copies. We're looking at very sophisticated levels of counterfeit networks. So ultimately, it's important to look at the supplemental orders, to de-index as much as possible from the search engine so people can't find those websites, to suspend associated accounts that are connected with the proliferation of the data, to shut down social media sites, particularly on Facebook. Facebook's by far the most important at the moment. Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, YouTube, LinkedIn, they're all important networks, but in terms of volume, Facebook is absolutely the king at the moment. And then to also shut down the payment providers, because ultimately you can't, if you remove the ability for somebody to buy something because there's no payment mechanism, then you effectively invalidate that website. And then finally, looking at the financial impact of a program like this. And this is taken from actual data, and it was taken from what a customer told us, as opposed to us making the numbers up. And it was looking at the impact of removing one network that contained a whole raft of different sites, but ultimately that one network was generating 1.2 million visitors per month. And they broke it into two different halves. The first around the damage that could potentially cause, and then secondly about the substitution rate and the additional sales they could have generated from that. And in terms of damage, and again, as I say, this is their data, this isn't something we've put together. From the 1.2 million visits per month, they were looking at an average conversion rate of 15%, which netted out to be 180,000 transactions. They then said, okay, let's be incredibly conservative and say that only 1 in 4 people actually transacted, which would be a pretty low number, but that would still bring it out to 45,000 transactions a month. The average retail price on the counterfeit networks was 150 euros. The damage potentially was 6.7 million euros. That's in 1 month. And then the flip side of that is to look at the additional sales. So from the 1.2 million visits, 40% of that was what was deemed usable traffic. And usable traffic would typically be would be based on websites that weren't containing the words fake, replica, cheap, outlet, discount, and a number of words. So it was people that were actually specifically looking for the brand. They then used their own in-house conversion rate for the amount of spend that they get on their own website of 0.5%, which nets out to 2,400 transactions a month. Their average retail price of people buying online is 250 euros, so that netted out to be 600,000 euros a month in substitution rate. So the net impact can be extremely high. So in summary, an online brand protection strategy must be based on reliable qualification and prioritization of the landscape and the different types of cases. Most people on the call today, maybe network intelligence, things like that, is of far less importance than just looking at the high-value targets on maybe Facebook or maybe on mobile applications. So it's important to understand where the priorities should be, to then have continuous and targeted enforcement across the organization to create a sustainable success and a clear return on investment. And to look at the flip side of the defensive brand protection strategy of ensuring you've got the correct domain strategy versus the correct online enforcement strategy, and to take offensive actions against those networks where they come by. And then finally, litigation in some cases it's absolutely worth doing. The police love to get involved with organised crime. It's one of the things that every police force around the world likes to beat. But the PR benefit reinforces a brand's strength to its consumers, which will bring financial benefits and equally will scare off infringers. So that's all the areas that I wanted to cover this morning. I really appreciate your time. We've got a little bit of time for questions now, so please feel free to type in the screen on the bottom, and if there are any questions. Okay, the first question I've got through is, we don't sell anything online. What are the ROI? So I assume that this is coming from a company that is possibly more services based as opposed to a physical goods provider. So it's a really good question, and again, I'll go back to say it sort of depends on where in the organisation you sit and what some of those measurements could be. It could be around traffic volume. So if you're removing content from websites, if you're regaining some of the good traffic that's connected with that, what the overall cost of that traffic would be. It could be the amount of views on a YouTube channel. It could be the amount of likes that you're generating on a monthly basis on your key social media platforms. Or it could be a measurement of either the success of your affiliate program or the cost per click that is being driven as a result of policing your affiliate. So there's lots of different ways to measure that. Okay, next question. With high-value targets, what happens to the website? It's absolutely an area that I should have covered. Thank you for asking the question. Often with the lawsuits that we've been involved with, or that we've provided the data and the information for, what happens is that they go to court. The vast majority of these are .com sites because they're the cheapest to register and the cheapest to maintain. So the typical approach is that a lawsuit will happen in the US, and the judge will grant ownership of website and content that's connected with the website to the brand owner. Now, it should be said that it's a first-come, first-served basis, so there could be a website that is selling counterfeits against multiple brands, but it will be the first company that could prove that it was part of the network that would actually retain ownership of that. That also retain ownership of the domain name and any proceeds that are in a PayPal account or any other payment mechanism account. So there's a real physical amount of money that you could generate from this. But equally, you could end up with potentially thousands of websites. For most of our clients, the vast majority of those websites aren't ones that they would want to own. They're not ones that they would monetize. So they would relinquish ownership of those, just let the domain names expire, but continue to police them to ensure that no content was posted on those websites. We've got another question here, which is trying to compare us to a competitor. Happy to have that conversation in an offline environment. I think the competitors that you speak about, they're really good at certain aspects of physical enforcement and investigative work on the ground, but probably in an online environment, I see far more organizations using our services sitting alongside this other company's services. There's a good question about testing the service. Typically, I'd say for all of our clients and all of the companies that I work with, we don't go in to sell you stuff. We have to approach each client as unique. And you could be one of the largest brands in the world that isn't actually being abused online. So a service like MarkMonitor isn't going to deliver very much value. Equally, we have clients that are pretty small organizations that they may only be a $5 million company. That for most people, you'd think, well, actually, managing the online environment wouldn't be a priority for them. But it can actually have a material impact to the organization. And we've got proven ROI with very small companies, right the way through to some of the biggest biggest companies in the world, be it from a fashion perspective, pharmaceutical perspective, IT, electronics. We're very lucky that we've got a very broad remit behind that. There's a question about budget. What sort of budget should a small brand allocate for annual enforcement? It almost comes back to my previous answer that we really need to look at things on a case-by-case basis. That, you know, I've worked with a number of companies before where at the end of doing some initial discovery and mapping out their threat landscape, that I've just turned around and said, look, you know, this is the issue that you have. You don't need a service like MarkMonitor, but yeah, happy to provide you with that data, and let's talk again in 12 months' time to see whether things have changed. So it's a very difficult question to answer. We have some clients that are spending 20,000 euros a year. We have some clients that are spending 500,000 euros a year. If you're a smaller brand, you're obviously going to be focused at the smaller end of that. But I would genuinely say that it's more important to look at the threat and then what the return on that threat could be, rather than to look at the price. Certainly from an initial perspective, that if there happen to be rogue sites that are generating, in fact, I remember a case for one of my clients where the first sites that we identified that were selling counterfeit products had more visits per day than the brand owner's site. There's an ROI just on that one website. Now, if that was the only website that was infringing their brand, I would have a very good case for daily enforcement and daily scanning. But ultimately, it could just be that one website that is the tipping point. And then final question that because we're literally right on the edge of the time, is great question, or great prompting question. Thank you for that. Is it possible to download a copy of the presentation? Sure. If you drop me an email, then I can happily email you a proper copy. But equally, this whole WebEx is being recorded and is available for distribution, and should be on our website in the next day or so. And there'll be links from that, I believe, to a PDF version of the presentation. So I really appreciate the time that people have spent listening to this. I hope it's added a little bit of value to a Tuesday morning. It's rather dull in Amsterdam at the moment, so hopefully it's brightened a few people's days. But any questions, please get in contact, and it's been great fun chatting to you all. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.